I'm Ron Payne. I'm president of the Otter Creek Aububon Society. Just want to talk about some upcoming events that we have. You may see them scrolling on the screen there. We've got a wildlife walk at Haugenbuch Park in the Bird Grassland coming up this Saturday, 8 a.m. Weather's going to be great.
Yes, it is.
And we've also got coming up soon our salamander crossing program in Salisbury. We have a sign-up sheet over there if you're interested. Separate sign-up sheet for salamander crossing. We've also got a sign-up sheet for our normal events list. But if you've signed up in the past for salamander crossing, sign up again because we throw that list out every year. We have a unique list every year. Wet nights in the next few weeks, and you'll get a message on the day, and then a message to confirm that it's going to be good, and then go out there and count and move salamander and frogs across the road. Our speaker tonight is Haugenbuch from Audubon, Vermont. Close enough?
Yep, close enough. I've heard worse.
Conservation bio plant guy. And he's going to talk to us tonight about the bird-friendly maple syrup project. So.
Great, thanks, Ron. All right. Well, thank you for coming out. It's kind of one of those evenings where you look outside and you say, maybe I'll just stay here for right now because of the rain and everything going on. But it is a pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming out to hear a little bit about a relatively new project that Audubon Vermont has been involved in. We are just in 2016. We are just entering into the third year of the Bird-Friendly Maple Project, and this is something that really ties in very well and complementary to a lot of the other work that Audubon Vermont has been doing here in Vermont around forest bird-based conservation. We have some other projects that have gotten actually national attention called Foresters for the Birds, working a lot with consulting foresters and state lands foresters to bring the concepts of bird habitat into the management of forest land that they are taking care of for other private landowners. And this is kind of an extension of that. And this is, I'll say, is a very personal project for me. It's something I have a very near and dear close connection to as a hobby maple producer myself. But also it's something I've been thinking about doing for the last 10 years. And this goes back to my graduate days, Antioch University, New England, where I studied the implications of maple sugar bush management for neotropical migrant songbirds, and was able then to come back to Audubon. I'd worked there previously, and actually now get into actually getting out and meeting with maple producers and bringing these concepts and messages to the industry. So it's a real personal win-win for me, and I hope that you'll find it interesting and something to be checking out yourself. So, of course, this is the time of year we drive here. I'm just driving down from Waterbury, where I live. I passed two sugar houses where the site of steam was billowing out of there, and those of us from Vermont and been spent a lot of time here, or New York as well, know that this time of year really is typically just getting into maple sugaring season. But for this year, some people were starting to produce their syrup before Christmas in certain parts of the state. So it's definitely kind of an oddball season. Who knows how it'll end up in the end. But the point here is that we are a maple sugaring, a maple syrup state, and all of the images that you see here are things that we see as we travel around the state during the late winter, early spring. By the way, these are all sites that you would find if you came up to the Green Mountain Audubon Center in Huntington, where we have a 500 tap sugar bush. We do things the old-fashioned way with buckets that you see there. And I joke the only thing that doesn't put us back in more colonial times with our sugaring is that we don't have a horse drawing our sleigh through the woods to collect the sap. We have 34 horses in a Kubota tractor. So maple sugaring is a big thing for us, and we don't really know how many maple producers there are in Vermont, believe it or not. But it's certainly in the thousands. Just because some people are small, they may not say they're producers or officially. But we do have a lot of people sugaring, and that covers a lot of forest land in Vermont. Some people just have a couple acres that they tap their trees and collect the sap from. But we're also working with people who have a couple thousand acres that is all being managed for sap production. And that can certainly have implications for birds and bird habitat out there on the ground. just to kind of give some perspective to the important role that Vermont has in the maple sugaring industry. This graph is from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it shows basically from last year the production of maple syrup combined in the country and the percentages of the different maple producing states that made up that entire crop. So maybe surprising, maybe not to some of you. Vermont continues to be the leader in terms of the amount of maple syrup we produce from the rest of the country. 41% of the maple syrup produced in the U.S. last year came right here from Vermont. Closely followed, well, not closely, but followed by New York State at 18% of that crop. Now, the majority of the maple syrup in the world comes from north of the border, up in Quebec and Ontario. But in terms of the states, Vermont is well known as kind of the maple state. When people think Vermont, they often think about the maple syrup that's produced here. Those forests that we get our sap from to take back to the sugar house and boil down to maple syrup, though, a lot of people they visit the sugar bush, which is our name for the forest that we manage for sap production and we collect that sap from. But they tend to not think about the sugar bush when it looks like this. We tend to think of it when there's the sugar house with the steam coming out of it and there's lots of activity going on as people are working there. But for the rest of the year, there's lots of other activity going on in those sugar bushes, as probably some of us have been out in them and know. But what is the forest doing the rest of the year? When it greens up in the spring, this is obviously a late summer, early fall shot, but we're going to really be thinking about these sugar bushes during this time. So we're going to talk about producing maple syrup, and now we're going to talk about what happens out in those sugar bushes during the rest of the year. And that's when the bird aspect of things really comes into play. So we'll switch gears a little bit. I apologize for the distortion of this, but we can get the main message across just by looking at the coloration that's here. This map does a great job, I think, of telling story. Maps do that generally. And what we're seeing here are the results of the North American Breeding Bird Survey, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's one of the longest running bird survey projects that uses a consistent protocol here in the States. The colors represent the number of species, the mean number of species, forest birds now, recorded on different breeding bird survey routes. And when a lot of people think about, when we take trips to go look at birds in different places, but then I tell people, well, if you really want to maximize the number of species that you want to find, guess where you should go? Nowhere. Go out in the forest. Stay home, go out in the woods, because during the breeding season, we are home to some of the greatest diversity of forest nesting songbirds of anywhere else in the country. So New England as a whole, the Adirondack Park, we'll see over there, and the upper Midwest all share that great diversity of songbirds. So we take this fact that we're the #1 maple producing state in the country. We also have some of the greatest diversity of songbirds nesting here in the country, and then sugaring and the bird conservation things start to come together into a picture. Yeah.
Can you clarify what per route means?
Per route. So the breeding bird survey, they set out established routes. I believe they're about 3 miles long. They're roadside routes, and so a volunteer would go and they'd travel this route and record. They'd stop periodically and record the species that they see or hear. So the numbers would be per route, the mean or average number of species recorded.
And each route's a certain distance, so one route over this part of the country is the same, like 50 miles.
Right.
Travel trip for this.
Well, I don't know if all of the routes are exact. I don't know if anybody else knows this either, if they're all the exact same route. I suspect they're probably a distance. I suspect they're probably not, but I'm not sure exactly how they set those. I don't know, Ron, if you know any more about that. Okay. Yeah.
I noticed it says forest birds, and I have spent quite a number of years with the quotas.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking they have they have a lot of birds that aren't forest birds.
Sure, absolutely. And the same would be true in Florida or whatever it might be. There's going to be different species of birds that would increase the diversity there. This is really looking specifically at the forest end of things. Yeah.
So it might be that even which places are red and which are blue would change if you included all birds.
Yes, that is true. Although I've seen some other maps that do look at the entire suite of species, and they don't change that much as a whole. I think that the New England area, the Northeast, still maintains the highest, some of that highest diversity during the breeding season of anywhere else. Now, many of these species are migratory in nature, and we know that when we go out in the forest now. There's not a lot of activity happening. Of course, we do have year-round residents. But a lot of the birds that we talk about and we focus on with our bird conservation efforts as Audubon Vermont and with the Bird Friendly Maple Project are those neotropical migrant species. And just as a refresher, neotropical migrant essentially means that the population of a species, the majority of that population of a species, migrates south of the Tropic of Cancer during the winter months and then returns north of that line again to nest and breed during the summer months. So that's how we define neotropical migrants. So this really paints the picture where even though we're talking about Vermont, New England, maple sugaring, it really is a global bird conservation effort because of the bird species that we're focusing on and are coming back to use our sugar bushes for nesting in. They're part of a much more global story than just being limited to the residents that we have here. As an example, this handsome bird, the scarlet tanager, just showing the range map for that species, the brownish color indicating where the breeding season range is for that bird. So basically anywhere east of the Mississippi, upper two-thirds of the U.S. is where this bird will nest. But look where it is during the winter months down in South America. And so just kind of illustrating the fact that if it comes back and nests, if a scarlet tanager pair comes back and nests in our sugar bushes, look at that global implications of that sugar bush, even if it's only 10 acres, is playing for that species. So one of the most important messages I do want to make sure people walk away with from here this evening is to understand that sugar bushes, by nature, inherently, are pretty good places for birds. So the reason I want to say that is because I don't want ever anybody to walk away and be like, well, gee, I got some syrup from somewhere that wasn't bird friendly, so I hope they weren't doing things bad out there. Well, their management practices can vary widely, but the fact that it's a sugar bush means that it's staying as a forest and most likely has some fairly large trees out there if it's been a sugar bush for a long time. The converse of that would be to have that be broken up into smaller chunks, fragmented forest, maybe converted to non-forest habitat, and certainly that would be one of the biggest threats to any of the birds that may be nesting out there. So just by the fact that it's staying as a forest really makes these sugar bushes good places for birds to be nesting to begin with. But with a little bit of extra thought and specific consideration to the habitat needs of some of those birds that will be nesting out there, we're trying to help make those sugar bushes not just good places for birds, but really good places or great places for them to successfully come back, nest, raise the next generation of their species, and focus in particularly on some of these birds that we are seeing long-term population declines in throughout their range, like the wood thrush over here on the right. That's one of the bird species that may be nesting in a sugar bush if the management helps support some of the vegetation structure that bird is looking for. So putting all this together, this was kind of the impetus for the Bird Friendly Maple Project. Audubon kind of took the lead, again, working out of our forest bird initiative, the forest bird conservation efforts we've been doing. And we brought in some partners, the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, the state agency we have been working with quite a bit with forest conservation over a number of years. But we added a new partner with this, and that was the Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association, which is kind of the trade institute or organization for representing the maple industry. And really, the success of this project has been and will continue to be instrumental on the fact that it's a partnership and kind of involving all of the key stakeholders from both the maple industry and the forest end of things, forest management end of things, and the bird angle to make sure that we're all meeting each other's needs and helping to support this project and see what we want to see happening out on the ground. We're not trying to get sugar makers to manage just for birds. We want them to be able to still make that maple syrup crop, but to integrate into that the habitat needs and considerations that all of these birds have when they're out there. So it's really it's a meshing of disciplines as opposed to thinking kind of single-focused or single use of that forest. So we're going to look at a couple different photos thinking to try to illustrate what do we mean by bird-friendly sugar bush. What does a bird-friendly sugar bush look like? What are some of the management activities that someone may do in their forest if they wanted to be considered bird-friendly? So I want you to take a good look at this photo, soak it all in, enjoy the nice beauty of it, serenity. And then we're going to flip to the next one, which has two different sugar bushes. And I want you to see if you can find a couple things that are different between, not between these two photos, but between these two and this one. So here we are with this one again. And then back over here, these are all sugar bushes. You can see the tubing, which is the method of sap collection that most sugar bushes, maple producers use these days as opposed to buckets. But there are some very distinct differences between them. What's one that you noticed?
The first picture doesn't have really good low-story habitat or ground cover.
Okay.
That's a single species probably on the ground there. And it doesn't have any mid-story cover either.
Okay. So really getting at some of the, we would call that the structural elements of the forest. It's really just those tall trees that create the canopy overhead and really...
High story, upper story.
Yeah, yep, the overstory. All right. And that stuff on the ground, by the way, is hay-scented fern, which is can be somewhat invasive. So it's a native plant species, but it can be termed invasive, which means it can come in and just take over on certain areas. And certainly in this case, it would be really hard for a little maple seedling or other tree to get a hold and actually grow up through there. They do release some chemicals, the fern that is, through their roots that does inhibit the growth of other things during the time that the fern is growing there, as well as being very shaded during the growing season with all of that dense cover. So that's one difference between them. Any other things? Yes?
It looks like there's a more difference in the sunlight penetration. You were saying that the other one was shaded, but it wasn't shaded once you got to be 20 inches up.
Yeah, so right, exactly, right. So once you get above that fern level, it's more open, right? So the density of trees in this sugar, at least this part of the sugar bush, is very different than the density of trees in this one over here. What about the trees themselves? Do you notice anything about, when you just kind of look at, like this tree right here and this one over here, they're good examples compared to all of those that you're looking at right there. Yeah.
The other picture, the one on the right, is a good example of mixed species, mixed trees.
There you go. So these two photos have a greater diversity of vegetative species, particularly the overstory trees that are there. We've got on the left an American beech right there in the foreground. This is likely an eastern hemlock in here, and some other softwood species are mixing in with this photo on this side, as well as on the other side there, both in the upper overstory trees, but also in the understory. Down there looks like a lot of Haugenbuch growing there. So it's not all single species a forest. The composition is made up of different species, whereas this forest is essentially all sugar maple. And the reason for that, so why do we have some sugar bushes that are pretty much all a monoculture of sugar maple and others are mixed species? Well, there can be a couple of reasons for it. One is that this sugar bush, I know, has been passed on from generation to generation, and it has been managed over a lot of time to favor the sugar maple, because that's the species that wanted to be tapped for sap collection. These sugar bushes are relatively new on the scene. So the people who own them and manage them, they took a northern hardwood forest or a mixed forest, and they've made it a sugar bush by going in and running their lines and tapping those trees. And they haven't gone in and removed the other species. Well, the other thing that can happen is more of a natural thing. In some sites, based on their soils and other growing conditions, they just grow sugar maple. Particularly places in like Orange County, Vermont, on the other side of the state, they're just, you come to these pockets that no one intentionally took the other species out, but you just find sugar maple as what's growing there. From a bird perspective, which one do you think we'd like to see more of? These mixed species or these monocultures? The mixed species, yeah. So, and the reason for that, is that, as probably many of us know, different bird species prefer different forest types. If we're in this forest, we are likely to hear things like ovenbirds, eastern wood pewees possibly flying around in that openness that's there. But over here, we might also hear those birds, but at the same time pick up a blue-headed vireo or a black-throated green warbler or a Blackburnian warbler, birds that prefer softwood, birds that prefer a mix of species. The work that I did, my research on this topic, did show that bird species diversity and the total number of birds found in a sugar bush started to decline if greater than 75% of the sugar bush was in only sugar maple species. So the guideline that we have worked with our partners at the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation for thinking about being a bird-friendly sugar bush is we ask maple producers to manage to maintain at least 25% of their sugar bush using a measurement we call basal area, which is a common forestry measurement, in non-sugar maple species. And that can be red maple, as well as the other associates, white ash, eastern hemlock, red spruce, American beech, yellow birch, whatever it might be. And any time we can do that, we are going to have an opportunity to just bring in greater diversity of birds, and just the sheer number of those individual birds is likely to go up as a result of that. There are some other benefits, too, to the forest of not managing for monoculture, and we'll come to those a little bit later on. But it's really that mixed species thing that I wanted to kind of highlight with these particular photos here. Okay, we're going to try it again with some other ones. So again, the tubing's different color, so it's green versus the blue that we saw before. But look at this forest compared to these two. And actually, you've already mentioned kind of what I wanted to illustrate between these two different slides or different photos. So this one compared to that one. See those structural differences that we were talking about before? This one really, the trees are relatively small diameter. It's a relatively young forest, granted. But is there anything growing down in that lower level of the ground? No, there's not. How about in these photos? There's quite a bit. And again, on the left there, that is just thick with Haugenbuch. So imagine being the person in charge of setting up these lines. How many of you have walked through Haugenbuch before? Do you know why it's called Haugenbuch then? Because it does a good job of hobbling you and making your forward progress be much slower. But nonetheless, it's there, and the people who set up those lines, it was okay with them to leave that there. On this side, probably something a little more desirable for a maple producer, all sugar maple, regeneration of young sugar maple in this forest here. So why are some forests looking like this in their structure in terms of that low cover, and some look like this? And by the way, we do call this kind of the height of these two layers of vegetation. We refer to that as our understory layer when we talk about habitat. It's anywhere from ground to about 6 feet in height, and made up of woody stemmed vegetation. So back on that hay-scented fern slide, we don't really think of that as understory, because you're not likely to find birds like black-throated blue warbler, which is a classic understory nesting species, nesting in the fern. You will find them in Haugenbuch quite readily. As a matter of fact, I often seek that out if Haugenbuch is in the forest where they are. But they'll also use the sugar maple as well. Species here of vegetation isn't quite as important to the bird as the structure that vegetation provides. So this is the understory. Then you also mentioned midstory, which is the second layer we talk about. And that's everywhere from the 6-foot height range up to about 30 feet in height. And neither of these two photos has a lot of that midstory, but it can develop in time. Go back one here. There is midstory here, so we don't have to have just a tree that tops out at 25 feet. If we do have some structure from branches and foliage from taller trees in there, think of a red-eyed vireo, for example, that likes to hang its nest from that layer. Well, it may well put its nest right here, even though this tree is higher than 30 feet. So we just want to have some cover and structure within these different height ranges. Some forests don't have this structure because, like this one, for example, most likely the reason you don't see a lot of understory in here is just where this forest is naturally. We're probably familiar with succession and how plant communities change as time goes along. Well, all forests have to go through some successional patterns, and they reach a point, I call this the teenage forest. So it's not the old mature forest yet, and it's not the real young forest. It's kind of somewhere in between. And by default, those places tend to be structurally simple. They haven't developed yet those different layers of vegetation. But other times, you can get this condition of a lack of structure because of the intentional management that was taken there. I have been to sugar bushes in northern Maine on the Quebec border where, interestingly enough, folks from Quebec come into Maine and lease land to sugar as opposed to doing it in Quebec because of the politics of sugaring in Quebec. And I had the fortune of being taken on a tour of a developing sugar bush where two men had spent 3 years, not continuously, but working 3 years over time, with brush saws going through the woods and cutting out the young stuff that was growing there because it makes it easier to work in the woods and get around. It doesn't tend to, if your lines are running through that vegetation, it can cool the sap down, and if it freezes up in there, it may not fall as quickly as if it's open for the sun to hit it. So there are various reasons why people do that. But nonetheless, if that's the case, birds are not as likely to be able to find the habitat characteristics that they're looking for as if they're in a place like this. So the guideline we've established for working with maple producers is to say if you'd like to be considered managing for a bird-friendly habitat across your sugar bush, we'd like to have measured an average of 25% cover in these two vegetative layers, understory and midstory. So if I'm looking at this right here as one of my sample plots, this is essentially 100% cover in the understory layer. So we would average that out across all of the sample plots that we did, and we want to see at a minimum 25% cover. If someone doesn't have it, if they look like this, does it mean they can't be in our program? No, it doesn't whatsoever. They can be in our program if they agree to address that lack of understory, midstory structure through their future management, putting it in their management plan and signing off on a paper that says, yes, we will address this and work to achieve those conditions in the future. So we talk about this. We talk about people managing for a bird-friendly habitat. Doesn't mean that all of them are perfect right now. It'd be really rare to find one that was. But people are intentionally thinking about how can I get there, and they're going to take the actions to make that happen. Yeah?
Couldn't some management activities be undertaken for this particular stand to thin out some of the 4-inch diameter trees so that the mid-story isn't quite as dense to bring more light in?
That's exactly right. So what we would do is work with if the maple producer who is managing this has a forester, we'd work with them. If it's the maple producer themselves, we'd work with them to figure out what's the appropriate, called silviculture, forest management practices to go in there and manipulate the vegetation to get more sunlight in there, and either, if there were some seedlings there, get them some sunlight so they can take off and grow more quickly, or if there aren't any there, how do we try to establish them? So in this case, we may, without going to a lot of technical jargon, we might do something called a crop tree release, where we identify our best sugar maples we want to keep, as well as some other habitat-valued tree species, and remove some of the competitors, the lower quality trees, from around them to allow them freer to grow. At the same time, we put in small little gaps in the canopy where we might remove 3 or 4 trees over here so that there's a small hole created in the canopy of the forest to get some sunlight down in there. So that's just kind of an example of one way we can intentionally, through our management, create some of these conditions. I can guarantee you that this sugar maple regeneration is the result of management that was done. You can almost see the sunlight shining down. There's probably a gap, a small gap in the canopy that was created by someone harvesting trees from that area. And then we also have all the dead things that are out there in the forest, the vegetation that it's dead. So on the left side, we have our standing dead tree, or AKA snag. We also have trees we call cavity trees, which can be live trees that do have decay in the middle, and certain birds, like yellow-bellied sapsucker, may go and know that that tree is decayed in the middle and excavate a hole in it to make a nest cavity. Maple producers often do not like standing dead trees in their sugar bush. Any idea why? Because they fall down. And when they do, they might make this. But if that tree comes down and it comes down the right way, it's probably going to take down that line. It may not break the line or rip it apart, but it's going to be down on the ground. So it's going to require some work to clean that up. A lot of times in forest management wildlife guidelines, you'll see this recommendation to maintain 6 snags per acre. It's kind of a standard thing to think about, and bigger the better. So greater than 10 inches in diameter at chest height is kind of the preferred thing. Bigger is better because more species can use it. We realized in the sugar bush that's a lot to ask producers to retain, particularly when they're working those woods. Big snags can be a safety hazard in addition to coming down on lines. So to try to at least make sure there's something out there, our guideline is to maintain at least 2 snags per acre. So at least we know we're going to keep them, or if we don't have them, how can we create them? How can we recruit them in to be a part of the forest in the future? When those things come down, they do create what we call coarse woody material. This is a sugar bush just outside. The lines are kind of running over here, so that's just outside of where the tubing is. That coarse woody material and fine woody material, that being the tops of the trees, the finer branches, both have high ecological values, not just as bird habitat and perch sites for birds and cover and potential insect food sources in there, but the ecological values beyond that are nutrient cycling. If you have a lot of deer in your sugar bush that like to eat the little seedlings that grow up, if you leave your tops out there in the forest, the seedlings can get started and grow in there without the deer many times being able to get to them and browse them away. So again, our guideline for that on the coarse woody material is at least 4 logs greater than 10 inches in diameter on the ground per acre. All of these guidelines are at the same level as things like organic certification or people who are involved in Natural Resources Conservation Service programs, that they get some funding to help with habitat work. We didn't want to be recommending things that were going against what some other programs that people might already be involved in were. So we tried to work with these other groups to make sure we were all on the same page with things. And of course, all of this really does need to start. I kind of alluded to this already, but having a plan, a management plan, that is a requirement to be in the program. You do have to have a forest management plan that describes your being intentional about what you're doing there to incorporate bird habitat into your sap production efforts. And that should be informed by an inventory, forest inventory done by a forester, as well as having myself come out and do habitat assessment and habitat inventory to see how well your current condition of your sugar bush matches up with those guidelines that we've established. This is a fairly local maple producer to all of you. That's Matt Davis from Little Haugenbuch Farm in Bristol. And Matt and his wife Caitlin, they are vendors here at the Middlebury Farmers Market. And they also, I believe, have their maple products in the co-op here in town. So they are one of our bird-friendly, they're recognized as being bird-friendly maple producers. So we go out there during the green season when we can really look at things like cover of vegetation, listen for the birds and look for the birds that are out there. And it's a great way to interact with maple producers and help them to really understand what it is that we're talking about. Once someone agrees to doing these things, to meeting the criteria that we've established, we put our assessments, the assessment that I do goes together into a written report saying, here's your current condition of your forest, here's the guidelines we've established, and here are the gaps between the two. If you agree to address these and you sign off on the paper indicating you will address those things, then you can be formally recognized, not certified. We're not at that level of things. Certification really involves a much deeper involvement. Third party has to be involved. But we really want to recognize people who are doing good work out there to think about birds and other ecological values. So what do you get? Well, you can hang a sign. You got your bird-friendly sign, maple sign here with the scarlet tanager, kind of our poster bird for the project. They've put that sign on the outside of their sugar house so that visitors coming by can say, what's that thing all about? What's the bird-friendly thing? And then they can explain it to them. And then you can also take these stickers that we've developed and put them onto, and you won't be able to see it, but I've got a container right here. This is from our Audubon Center, which is also, it has to be, right, one of our bird-friendly sugar bushes, so that people, they might say, what is this thing all about? And it's an opportunity to start the education process. Because remember, this project's still young. How many of you have ever seen a jug of syrup with a bird-friendly sticker on it? Ron has. But most people they don't yet know what this is. It's just now kind of coming into the fold. It's no different than when bird-friendly coffee first came out. People are like, what is this all about? We're hoping that someday we'll achieve that same recognition. That people will know, hey, I know what that means. It means that the person that made this syrup, they made sure that the habitat needs of birds were met when they were out there managing that forest. As we stand here today, we have, again, just having completed the second year, really only 1 year of those 2 involved me going out and doing the assessments and getting people in the program. We have 8 maple producers around the state right now who are formally recognized. I've got 12 on tap, no pun intended, on tap, to get into the program this summer, including some of the biggest producers in the state. So I've heard some people kind of being skeptical. I've done some presentations at the Vermont Maple conferences that are hosted in the state and other maple events. Some people are just kind of, that's birds. I don't really care about birds. I don't want to do that. That's only for people, hobby sugar makers. Well, our smallest sugar bush that we're working with now is the Audubon Center, 500 taps. And the biggest one is 81,000 taps, which is a Thunder Basin Maple Works up in Cambridge. One of the bigger ones we have is over 200,000 taps. That is shown interest in getting involved as well. So it really is for all scales, and I would argue that it means more, or conservation-wise, it's more valuable for the bigger producers because they're influencing a much larger area of land, thousands, a couple thousand acres in some cases, of forest land that can either be managed in ways that don't support birds as well or really do support them more effectively. All right, so in addition to birds, what are some of the other benefits that thinking about birds, so bird considerations brought into our management, what else is it going to benefit? And these are some things that I can talk to maple producers that are somewhat on the fence. I don't know if I'm not really into birds, but I'm into other things. Deer. So deer, yeah, might be into deer. The thing with most of the management we're talking about really isn't going to create good deer habitat because we're not talking about big areas of shrubby cover that a lot of deer management is based on. It would be, except they wouldn't want to cut down as many trees as they would have to do in their sugar bush in order to create that. But a lot of people are concerned about the long-term health and sustainability of their woods. And so things like forest diseases, that photo on the left is a Utapella canker, which is something that affects sugar maple trees. What it does is makes that tree susceptible now to breakage and wind. And on the right is the sugar maple borer insect, which essentially gets in the wood and eats around and girdles the tree on the inside, preventing the flow of water and nutrients up and down, and eventually kills the tree. No maple producer wants to see these things in their sugar bush. Going back to that threshold about having at least 25% of your sugar bush in non-sugar maple, we can lower the intensity of these outbreaks, disease and insects, and the duration that they exist in your sugar bush by following those same guidelines. University of Vermont did a specific study on this, and they found this threshold. If you have at least 25% of your sugar bush in non-sugar maple, these things are not going to be as intense or as long duration as if you're 90% sugar maple. Basically the same threshold that I found in my research in looking at bird species diversity and bird numbers. Coincidence? I think not. So that's one benefit, is to help lower the effects of insects and disease in your sugar bush. Another one in some places are non-native invasive plants. I'm sure many of you are familiar with those around here, things like honeysuckle and buckthorn and Japanese barberry. Those things get in the forest, they compete with the regeneration of other plants, and from a bird perspective, we don't really want to see them there either. The non-natives tend to not support the same diversity of native insects, which is a main food source for these birds when they're here nesting, as native plants do. As well as the fruits of some of these are just not as nutritionally, or high in nutrition as the native plants. So when birds gorge on these in preparation for these berries on preparation for migration, they may be leaving Vermont with lower levels of fitness than if they had eaten native plants. So part of our requirements are to, if you have non-native invasive plants, you need to have a plan for how to address those plants. and that would be in your management plan. The elephant in the room often is climate change. Is it real? Is it not real? Whatever people are subscribing to on that, we do know that some of the same bird-friendly management practices are the same things that our partners at the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, as well as the U.S. Forest Service, are recommending for making a forest more resilient and more adaptable to a changing climate. So things like getting regeneration, young growth coming in, maintaining species diversity, the same strategies that have been identified for helping to address climate change as well. So it's a win-win-win all around for these different features. And then something we've already spoken a little bit about is the economics of it. Will there be a time when syrup that has that label on it can bring a premium at the market? Will someone pay a little bit more for a quart of syrup that has that sticker? We found it happen with bird-friendly coffee. It took a while, but people finally came around to appreciating and being willing to help support that different way of growing coffee. And I think bringing it close to home, right here in Vermont, and people understand that by managing in certain ways, you're really going to help support those birds that we are a really key part of their annual cycle for. People may be willing to do that, pay a little bit more. We don't know that yet, but we're hoping to see that happen. If not, we are hoping that maybe we just introduce a new customer to a maple producer who may not otherwise buy syrup, and they say, hey, this is cool, I'm into doing that. A little anecdotal story, one of our producers way up in Derby, near the Canadian border, does a big open house weekend. We have the Vermont Maple Open House Weekend this year, the first weekend in April. They had somebody from Pennsylvania go online and search about sugar houses in Vermont. They were going to come to Vermont to go visit a sugar house. They went to Jed's Maple Products in Derby because they saw that they were involved in this bird thing with Audubon. And they told them that when they arrived on the scene. So I don't know if that's the only case where that's happened, but it's kind of, I think, an indicator of what can happen when people start to become aware that this is out there. And then it's just really the multi-generational aspect, being able to have a healthy, sustainable sugar bush that you can pass along, because if you are managing for birds, you're more likely to have a healthy, sustainable sugar bush. Being able to pass that on generation to generation. This is actually the family I was just referring to, the Wheelers, the Jed's Maple Products. So Steve Wheeler, his two sons, and his dad was sugared there. And so it's really, and his kids now are much older than that, but they want to take this on when it's their turn. So having a forest that will support that is important to many people. So just a couple of the birds that we think about and we highlight in here, and this will be, I think I've got 4 of them to kind of conclude things with here. I've put in the male, the female, when looking different than the male, an example of the nest and eggs, and then a song or two to play along with it. So everybody probably recognizes this bird. We already saw it on our sign. We joke around with kids sometimes. This is the black-winged redbird as opposed to the red-winged blackbird. But the song, we won't, for those of you who may not know this bird yet, we won't say exactly what its name is, but we'll listen to the song. The song is often described as a robin-like song, a robin who has a sore throat or a hoarseness to it, a scratchiness in it. But it does do something that robins don't do, as we'll hear towards the end. Let's see if we get this. Is that coming out anywhere else?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Kind of robin-y. But robins don't do this. Chipper on the end there. So one of our chipper tells us the difference between this bird and a robin, or a red-eyed vireo for that matter. You can stop now. How do I get you to stop? Okay, good. The scarlet tanager, again, the female during the breeding season looks very different than the male, and probably as many of you know, this time of year the male looks a lot like the summer female does. So that red coloration of the breeding male is not found if we saw scarlet tanager on its wintering grounds. This is probably one of the birds that nests higher up in the forest than any of the other ones from our list. So this bird tends to nest in that mid-story or upper mid-story or even a little bit higher. Generally a fairly flimsy looking nest. I found them on the end of hemlock branch one in particular on the end of a hemlock branch. You could stand underneath it. It was right over a trail at the Audubon Center, and you could look up and just see right up through them. Wasn't a lot to it, but they were using. That one looks a little bit more put together down there. This one's one of my favorites, showing the nest of this bird down here. Does anybody recognize this leaf? We've heard about this plant already. Haugenbuch. So this bird really does, when Haugenbuch is in the forest, it will often put its nest in there, again, not because it's Haugenbuch, but because of the structure that it provides within this right height range. So this is my poster bird for an understory nesting species. So in the lack of an understory, we're not going to really find this bird out there nesting. The female, again, looking quite different. Even the breeding female looking different than the male. And the song's just kind of a buzziness, rising up, buzz, buzz, buzz. Do you all know this one? This bird? This is the black-throated blue warbler. It's always nice when birds are named after the way they look. Helps you to remember them a little bit better. So black-throated and blue. Somebody once, when I tried to, was learning bird songs and trying to get the difference between black-throated blue and black-throated green, they said, well, black-throated blue is buzzing up to the blue sky, just rising up. And that worked for me. Bzz, 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 bzz. Whereas the green, which is also kind of buzzy, goes up, z, 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 zoo, z, goes up, down, and up like the green mountains. The green, black-throated green warbler. May not work for you, but it worked for me. All right, so not as colorful. Female looks the same, so we only have one picture of them here. And this one has kind of some interesting little hair-like projections there around his face, which is characteristic for the group of birds this belongs to. This is in the flycatcher family. You may have a similar bird, related species to this, the eastern phoebe, that nests up under the eaves of your back porch. They kind of arrive fairly early, and they make a nice muddy, mossy nest up in there and tend to come back and use that same one over and over. This one's that we find more out in the forest as opposed to in more developed urban areas. And I like this bird because it says its name when it sings, and also, so its habitat feature that it really keys in on within the sugar bush or in the forest is it does like that mid-story layer, but it also likes it when there are some gaps, some small openings in the forest, because those openings let in what? Light. And when we get more light coming in, we're likely to have more insects flying around. So this flycatcher will sit on the edge of the gap in the forest and fly out, grab an insect, fly back, and feed on it. So that's kind of one of the benefits of doing some management to open up small holes in the canopy, is you can better support this bird and hear its song, saying its name. Pee-wee. Ooh, I like that. So this is our eastern wood pee-wee. A relatively late return, migrant return to our forests. Oftentimes, at least in northern Vermont, I don't know about if it's any different here, but it's usually not until maybe mid-second week in June before we start hearing them farther north. When do you get them around here in the forest? End of May. Okay, so a week or so off maybe, what we find up there. And the last one that we'll look at here, this is, in terms of a song, I think there's no parallel to the song of this particular species. If you hear this out in the woods, you're going to remember it. Amazing coming out of one bird to get all that different stuff. And what's that? So, well, this one's not a song. Song sparrows have a nice song to them as well. This is one of our thrushes. And we have three lowland lower elevation forest thrushes that we could find around here. Our state bird, the hermit thrush. This isn't that. Yeah, this one is the wood thrush. The other thrush being the veery, which does that kind of trilling downward. We often hear it at dusk, especially near wet areas, near streams, wetlands. But the wood thrush, that song is really, really characteristic to it. Unlike the other thrushes, it's spotting on its breast there. They all have some spotting. It's much more more pronounced and stands out on the wood thrush compared to some of the others. Like a robin, which is also a thrush, they kind of, it has these blue eggs, and it nests up in that mid-story as well. Right there, it's nesting in a sugar maple sapling. So I think I can. Shattering glass, as it's called at the end there. It won't be long. A couple more months, we'll hear them out there again. All right. And then this is the next to last slide. This I just wanted to show you. These are from the research again that I did in graduate school. This is the full species list of birds that I found in sugar bushes. And what I did was highlight those species that are we call them priority bird species or responsibility species through Audubon, Vermont. These are the bird species that we really kind of highlight and think about in our efforts because they fit one of two criteria. One is that perhaps they are a species showing long-term population decline, like the wood thrush throughout its breeding range. But we also focus in on birds that are doing quite well with their populations. Ovenbird, right at the top of the list, as we might expect to find it. In any hardwood forest. Ovenbirds are all over the place. Why do we have them as a priority bird? Well, the reason for that is that these, again, the yellow birds here, yellow-highlighted birds, decreasing population, or the northeast forest is where the core breeding population of that species returns to every year for migration. So it's not necessarily just Vermont or the sugar bushes, but the northeast forest up through the Gaspé Peninsula in Canada is kind of the core. So the higher percentage of these bird species populations, breeding populations, return to these areas. So in the absence of nice, high-quality forests here, some of the birds like ovenbirds that are currently doing well may not be doing well into the future. And surprisingly, I was kind of surprised by this. The black-throated blue warbler was the third most abundant species in my research. The reason I was surprised by that is because if we think about kind of classic sugar bush management, which just has like that very first picture I showed you with all the hay-scented fern, that's not black-throated blue warbler habitat. It doesn't have that low structure. The reality was that of the 10 sites that I've looked at, there was enough structure there in them that they were able to support black-throated blue warbler. Just to kind of final up here things, wanted to share with you who the different participating producers currently are up there, as well as, again, our project partners, and then especially the financial support really headed up by the Vermont Community Foundation in order to help us to get out there and do the work we're doing. We're lucky right now, we're still in the third year pilot phase of this, so we've been able to do all this work with maple producers without them incurring a cost for it to happen, and that's been helpful to get more people in there. And it's thanks to these different groups and organizations that have helped us to do that. So that's what I got. I'm happy to take any questions that people might have about things or comments, but thank you again for coming out.